It's on. Um, Hello. Thank you so much for coming to what is the latest in our political fireside chats. Some of you may recall, but in 2010, we hosted a number of candidates and campaigns on campus, and we think this is a real value to Googlers to hear what's going on in our home state. So this is the latest in the political fireside chats for 2012. We will be offering the other side of this issue to come to campus and have the same opportunity to speak to Googlers and to hear questions from you all. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Alan.
So thanks for coming. I appreciate it. You know, this is an issue that I think sometimes is an abstract issue. You know, you think about the death penalty and it's kind of somebody else's problem. It's on the pages of the news and, you know, you see it that way, but it's not personal. And I feel like one of the things that's missing from political debate in general, but in this topic in particular, is the personal side of some of these issues. And so I've been talking to Natasha. In full disclosure, I support this cause. I support the Safe Ballot Initiative. I'm one of the funders of that initiative. But in the course of that conversation, I've learned a lot about the issues. And one of the things that she and I talked about was, you know, would it be possible to host an event here? Would it be possible for us to learn a little bit more about the issues and the impact of those issues? And she did something which was fantastic, was she actually just put together a panel here of people on, you know, 2 people that were on death row that actually, you know, through, you know, a long and I'm sure arduous process that they'll tell you about, were exonerated. And also a former warden at San Quentin that can show you that perspective. And of course, Natasha's working very hard on a ballot initiative that she'll tell you about as well. But the main thing that I wanted to get out of this morning is to just personalize it. It's not an abstract issue. It's a very specific one. The consequences of our decisions are enormous. Probably the most, you know, single most enormous consequence that any, you know, society or decision can make. And I feel like because of that, it's really important for us as individuals and as citizens to know what we're getting into and what we have got into. So with that, I wanted to, you know, turn it over. Do you want to start with introductions here?
Sure. My name is Natasha Minkser. I am the campaign manager for the Safe California Act.
My name is Jeannie Woodford. I'm the warden on the panel, but currently I'm the executive director of Death Penalty Focus, and I'm the proponent of the initiative to replace the death penalty in California.
My name is Nathan Fields, and I'm the chairman of Witness to Innocence Compensation Committee. I spent a total of 18 years in prison, 11 and a half on death row for a crime I didn't commit.
I'm Randy Steidle, and I am president of the board of directors of Witness to Innocence, and I spent almost 18 years in prison and 12 on death row for a crime I didn't commit.
So let's start with you. I think you know, let's start at the beginning of your story.
Well, first off, I would like to thank Death Penalty Focus and Safe California and the Google Policymakers Group for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to explain exactly what happened to me with this barbaric system that Illinois had in place. In 1986, in a small town of Paris, Illinois, there was a gruesome murder of a young newlywed couple. And Paris was such a small town, you can imagine how it shocked the whole community. 4 weeks before these murders had happened, I had reported the local state's attorney to the FBI for drug distribution and protecting drug distribution in that small town. And it was 3 days after these murders that there was a knock on my door and wanted me to come downtown for questioning. I cooperated fully with the police. I had a brother that was an Illinois State Police officer. I had a grandfather that was a deputy sheriff. So I believed that you should cooperate with authority. I went down and gave him my step-by-step whereabouts, who I was with, what times I was there, and I was released. 7 months later, there was another knock on the door. 5 police officers come into my home with guns drawn, threw me down on the floor, and arrested me and booked me for a double murder I didn't commit. And you can only imagine the pain and the suffering that I felt when my little brother came to the jail, slammed a stool down in front of the holding cell and said, well, I've talked to the prosecutor and the lead detective, and they said If you cooperate, they won't seek the death penalty. And I can't repeat the exact words I told him that night in jail. It wouldn't be appropriate. He got mad and screamed at me and kicked the stool across the office floor and screamed, "They don't arrest people that aren't guilty." Now you can imagine anybody saying that, but my own brother said they don't arrest people that aren't guilty. My case was rife with corruption, political influence. The state had 2 alleged eyewitnesses that said they were present at the crime scene, but yet neither one of them saw each other. This young newlywed couple was just viciously stabbed over 50 times, and their home set on fire. I went from the comforts of my home to death row in 97 days. That's unheard of today. But through the years, there was no physical evidence, no forensic evidence, no DNA, nothing linking me to this crime but a town drunk who said he was an eyewitness and a mentally ill, violently mentally ill woman who claimed to be present and actually held the woman down while me and my co-defendant stabbed her to death. Yet she was free to go home after giving that statement. Can you imagine? My appeals process in the state of Illinois was nothing more than an exercise in futility because there is nothing to doubt. There was 2 alleged eyewitnesses, right? Even though their stories were not credible and didn't corroborate each other. I spent over 12 years on death row before I finally got some relief through the state of Illinois because my attorney, who was incompetent, didn't put on any mitigation at sentencing, and I ended up with the death penalty. Finally, I ended up with life without parole. I had one appeal left. It was a federal court. And after 14 years, there was finally enough publicity to embarrass the Illinois State Police, who assigned an investigator to review the case, hoping he would just rubber stamp it. And this cop didn't do that. He was one of those Serpico-type police officers that was a search for the truth to him. He tried 5 times to reopen the case, said, "You got 2 innocent men sitting here." He said, "I'm trying to bring closure to the murder victims' family members and address this corruption and wrongdoing within the police department and the state's attorney's office." He was denied 5 times to reopen the case. They said the case was too politically sensitive. But if it had not been for this police officer, at the very least, I'd be spending the rest of my life in prison because his reports and his investigation combined with my federal habeas corpus petition in federal court is what convinced a federal judge to either release or have the state retry me in 120 days. So after 17 years, 3 months, and 3 weeks, May 28th, 2004, I was released. And it was like being reborn into the arms of my family and my children. Alan?
That's quite a story. So also from Illinois, also in the same system.
Right.
Please tell your story.
My story begins in 1985. I was the manager of a Southside Chicago building. I had did what I always do every morning, which is go down the street to McDonald's and get a cup of coffee. As I was going to get the cup of coffee, the police pulled me over. I was not speeding. I was not doing anything wrong. They told me to show some ID, which I did. Upon showing the ID, the policeman went back to his car. When he came back, he had his gun out, and 2 other squad cars, unmarked, had pulled up, and they all pulled their guns out. They told me, "Keep your hands on the car." I told them, "I'm not gonna move, I'm not gonna move," because they had the guns aiming directly at me. They put me in the squad car. One of them got in my car, and we all drove to the police station. When we got to the police station, one of the cops told me, "Hey, Nate, we'll see you in 40 years. I really didn't understand what he was talking about because I was trying to figure why did they even bring me to the police station. While I was there, the police did not ask me any questions about any crime. They didn't interrogate me or try to get a confession or nothing. They just were just saying, "You're going down." So when I went for arraignment a couple of days later, I was shocked when I appeared before the judge and he read off that I was charged with a double murder. Make a long story short, my trial began before Judge Thomas Maloney. I went to trial. The case was very weak because I was arrested 13 months after it happened. There was no physical evidence, no DNA evidence. The sole suspect that they was looking for was a person that was 18 years old to 20, a light-skinned black male. At that time, I was 31 years old when I was arrested. And as you see, I'm not a light-skinned black male. That to the side, I went to trial before this judge and he found me guilty. Upon finding me guilty, I really thought that the judge was just prejudiced against me. And I had a co-defendant as well. And I really thought the judge was just prejudiced against me. But I didn't know what happened, but I know that evidence did not prove me guilty. It was about 5 high school students that testified at my trial that I couldn't have been the person. And there was only one eyewitness who claimed that he saw the crime from over 150 feet away playing baseball. They found me guilty, and upon finding me guilty, we went to the sentencing hearing. At the sentencing hearing, the very witness, the one witness that pointed me out, said that he had lied and that the police had coached him to say that I was the one and that they had manipulated the lineup. That to the side, the judge still would not give me a new trial or a stave off my death sentence. So I was sent to death row. I was given the death penalty. I went to death row. Death row, let me tell you something about it. It's like hell on earth. When I got there, a lot of guys that tried to help me before I left, they was either executed or they had lost their mind. The place is so restrictive. You're in a cell 5 by 8. You're led around with a dog chain, handcuffs, shackles, everywhere you go. You're allowed out the cell 1 hour per day. The stress that I saw on death row was so overwhelming to see so many men. I just couldn't believe that everyone was under a death sentence. Individuals started losing their mind. It was nothing to hear prisoners late at night talking to imaginary figures, talking to their children, talking to their wives, talking to anyone, just talking. Hearing prisoners yelling out in the middle of the night. Seeing prisoners who, a few days ago, they was calling you by your name. Now you come by their cell, they don't even know you. They have lost their mind. I saw prisoners who, they hadn't combed their hair in 13 years. They hadn't brushed their teeth 13 years. They hadn't taken a shower in years. The cell smelled like a lion's den. The guards would always, when the brass come on the unit, they would go in and clean these prisoners' cell out and try to deodorize it so that the brass wouldn't see what was going on or the visitors that was coming to the prison. While I was on death row, I was there for 11 executions of men who I knew. I had the unopportune opportunity to meet one of Illinois' most noted serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, who I met right as I came into the door. And we had a little situation that developed, and the guards wouldn't let us come near each other anymore after we had a little incident. But that to the side, what happened for me was one day I was reading the newspaper, and I saw in the newspaper they was talking about my judge who had sentenced me to death. And in the article it said that he had been indicted for taking bribes in murder cases. And he had taken a bribe in my very case. When I read this, I just fell to my knees and I started praying. What had happened, the judge had taken a bribe from my co-defendant's attorney to throw the case. My co-defendant's attorney had been corrupt and had bribed the judge on other occasions. I knew nothing about the bribe. When the FBI came into the courtroom and was sitting on the rows watching the trial, and the bailiffs told the judge that the FBI was in the courtroom, he knew that they was up on the bribe, and they were. They had tapped his phone. In a desperate attempt to cover it up, he gave the money back to my co-defendant's attorney, and he had convicted me to cover it up. At this present time, this judge has served 13 years in prison for doing this. He is the first and the most corrupt judge in American history to be found guilty of sending individuals to death row to cover up a bribe. At that point, I got a new trial. I was found not guilty at my new trial. I represented myself on my certificate of innocence before the chief judge of Cook County against the very prosecutors who was trying to send me back to death row, and I won. A certificate of innocence is a legal document that declares that legally you were innocent. After that, I filed the largest lawsuit in Illinois' history for a wrongful conviction. Thank you.
So Jeannie, you've seen it from the inside as well, on the other side of the cell block. Can you tell me your story?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here, and your stories are just so touching. It's just so difficult to believe that in America we have to worry about issues like this, but we do. So I started at San Quentin State Prison in 1978, 2 weeks after graduating from Sonoma State University with a degree in criminal justice. I started as a correctional officer. At that time, death row had about 8 inmates on it. I stayed at San Quentin for over 26 years, promoting up through the ranks until I became the warden in 1999. And during that time, I saw death row grow from the 8 inmates that were there when I started to where it is today. We have over 725 people on death row in the state of California. It's the largest death row in the United States. When I became the warden in 1999, well, I should say, I feel like I've grown up with the death penalty because I've seen it from just every point of view and from every position working within a prison, having worked on death row as a correctional officer, as a counselor, as a captain, and then I became the chief deputy, and then finally the warden. But when I became the warden in 1999, it became my responsibility to carry out executions. And so I've been involved in 4 executions. I've always been morally opposed to the death penalty. But when you're the warden, you tell yourself it is your job to carry out the laws on behalf of the citizens of the state of California. But then I want you to think about that. What is it that we ask of public servants? So I describe it this way. As the warden, you get up 30 to 60 days prior to a scheduled execution. You put on your clothes and you get ready to go to work. You hug your husband goodbye. You tell your children to have a great day at school. You get in your car, and for me, I drove the 28 miles to San Quentin, knowing that I was going there to carry out an execution. And as the warden, it's not only your job to carry out an execution, it's your job to lead your staff through that process. And staff are involved in this process for many reasons, but most people believe that they're there carrying out the laws as the citizens expect them to do. So you end up the night of the execution, and you see it from every point of view. You see the victim's family members come to the execution, the inmate's family and their legal team. You watch the faces of your staff as you're carrying out that execution. And then after each execution, someone on my staff would say something like, "Did we improve public safety in California today?" And we never answered that question because we knew the answer was no. And so you start to think about this from a public policy point of view. And you look at the cost of executions. The state of California has spent $4 billion on the death penalty since 1978. $4 billion. We've carried out 13 executions. That means that each execution was over $300 million. And then because I've spent over 30 years in criminal justice, I've really studied the science of criminal justice. And I believe I know what works. And what really works to keep us safe is to spend our resources solving crime. And in the state of California, 46% of homicides and 56% of reported rapes go unsolved each year in this state. And we know what makes us safer is having more police on the streets. And yet, in California today, many communities are removing police because of our economic crisis. And so I am the proponent of this initiative because I believe in public safety, and I believe we can use our resources in a much more productive way that improves public safety in the state of California and keeps our children and our communities safer. Thank you.
Thank you. Natasha.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you very much to everyone at Google for having us here today. And I just have to say it's really an honor to sit on the stage with these individuals and to work with folks like this who have been through so much and bring so much personal experience to this. As Alan said, this is a personal issue for people, and it's easy to think that the death penalty doesn't touch our lives. It touches many people's lives, and you've heard some of their stories, and I'm sure you will have questions for them. I am the campaign manager for the Safe California Act. The Safe California Act is an initiative that will be on the November ballot this year in California. The initiative does three things. It will replace the death penalty with life without possibility of parole as the maximum punishment for murder. It requires every person convicted of murder to work in prison and pay restitution to the Victims' Compensation Fund. And it will take a portion of the money that we are going to save by replacing the death penalty and direct it to local law enforcement for the purpose of increasing the rate at which we solve rape and murder cases here in California. The Safe California Act will make sure that we never execute an innocent person here in California. You have heard Randy and Nate's stories from Illinois. These problems happen here in California as well. Hundreds of people have been wrongfully convicted in California of serious crimes. Many of them have been wrongfully convicted of murder. People like Frankie Carrillo, who works with us on this campaign. Frankie was just 16 years old when he was wrongfully convicted of a murder. It took 20 years for him to prove his innocence. These two men served themselves almost 2 decades in prison for crimes they did not commit. These mistakes are serious, and as Jeannie said, they continue to happen. The only way we can prevent the execution of an innocent person in California is if we replace the death penalty with the Safe California Act this November. The initiative will also save California over $100 million each year. It's surprising to many people, but the death penalty is enormously expensive, much more expensive than the alternative of life without possibility of parole. And that's because the entire process is more complicated. In fact, it's a double trial process. A death penalty trial involves stage 1, where you decide if the person actually committed the crime, just like every other criminal trial. But then there's a whole second trial where we decide whether the person gets death or life without parole. 2 trials requires 2 lawyers on the defense team, 2 investigators. The prosecution team is even larger. It takes months just to select a jury in a death penalty case, and the judge has to be specially qualified as well. This is all just to get to the death sentence. After that, there's literally 25 years of appeals in California death penalty cases. 25 years of court processes and more attorneys that we pay for. And one of the most surprising things is that the housing in death row cases here in California is more expensive than life without possibility of parole. If those 724 people who are now on death row were sentenced to life without parole instead, we would actually save $30 million a year just in the extra housing costs alone. You all know that California is in the midst of a terrible economic crisis and that we are facing terrible budget cuts just today. In fact, the governor signed a new budget with deeper cuts to social services, cuts to healthy families. I actually can't believe we live in a state where we are cutting a program called Healthy Families that gives health insurance to poor children, but we just cut that program because we just don't have the money we need for the things we need. And meanwhile, we waste over $100 million a year, every year, on a terribly broken death penalty in this state. That's why we need the Safe California Act. And the initiative for a 3-year period will direct $30 million a year to local law enforcement, specifically to increase the rate at which we solve rape and murder cases. I was shocked when I learned that 46% of murders go unsolved and 56% of reported rapes go unsolved every year in California. And behind those numbers are real people and real families. People like Lorraine Taylor. Lorraine Taylor's twin sons were murdered in Oakland. 2 kids in college. Their car broke down. They were on the side of the road trying to fix it in the wrong neighborhood. And they were shot and killed in a drive-by shooting. The person who killed them has never been caught. Lorraine Taylor has a group that she works with other mothers and fathers who have lost children to gun violence. And every week she goes down to the homicide department in Oakland and she asks about their cases. And every day, every week when she meets with the head of homicide, he sits and says to her, "I'm sorry, Miss Taylor, I don't have anything for you on this case." And she says, "What about this case?" And he says, "I'm sorry, Miss Taylor, we have no leads in that case either." It was Lorraine who told me that the Oakland Police Department couldn't afford to have a fingerprint analyst. And so for a while, they stopped collecting fingerprints. Those are the kinds of basic public safety needs that are not getting met right now in California as we lay off police officers and cut core services to our law enforcement. So by ending the waste on the death penalty, we are going to be able to redirect money to our most important needs, like our kids' schools. And for 3 years, we are going to direct funds directly to local law enforcement to meet the most important public safety need in California, which is catching the killers and the rapists who are still walking free on our streets. That is why we call this the Safe California Act, because this is about making California a safe place, protecting the innocent from wrongful execution, and protecting every one of our families from the people who are out there who could commit harm. And so we are going to ask you to support the Safe California Act this November as a really important step for making California the kind of place we all want to live in.
Great, thank you. So you guys, please, ask questions. It'd be great to get your impressions, but I'll start here. Let me just tell you, people ask me why I donated to this particular cause, and it really came down to one thing for me, is that our standard for guilt and innocent is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a perfectly fine standard. I think that's a standard where, for somebody that's shoplifting, that seems like a perfectly reasonable standard. But to put this man to death, I don't know. It just, for me, doesn't feel like that's the standard that we need, and that we as Californians would feel comfortable with that standard being applied in these kinds of cases. And I think it'd be a harder problem to change the whole standards associated with it. And obviously it's also a problem, in my mind, of how wildly diverging that standard has been applied based on ethnicity, based on what state you're in, based on prosecutors, based on other things. And I can't sit back and have the feeling that we as Californians and we as Americans are being fair and that we're doing the right thing. And the money is obviously important too, but I feel like, the basic fairness of the system is what I worry about most. Go ahead, please, ask your question.
Well, thank you for coming today. I'm actually somebody who's gone back and forth on the issue. I'm fully supportive of death penalty and then completely against it, and I can't seem to really fully 100% decide on which way I go. I think my issue is more a fear of people like Charles Manson and John Wayne Gacy and people who get life in prison and, even without the possibility of parole, a judgment down the line from the Supreme Court can say, oh, this new judgment says that these people can be let off, and then a new wave of appeals happen and people like that may be set free. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I think that's where a fear of mine lies, why I've gone back and forth on that. So I understand the rationale behind it, but the emotional side of me, I can't seem to let that fear go. And I think as the more cases you see of serial killers coming up, and I am completely ashamed of the legal system, what happened to you too and stuff, and I know it actually happens often. At the same time, I have to kind of look at my safety as well and my family members. So how do you kind of tackle that issue when you're going out and you're trying to convince people that this is the right thing to do?
Can I address that?
Sure, and I think, I actually had this conversation with Natasha a while back. I think this is a core issue, and I'm glad you brought it up right at the beginning.
I, like you, come from a conservative family. My granddad was a deputy sheriff. My brother was state police. And I used to see those people being put in handcuffs, drug across the TV screen. And, yeah, they look guilty to me, and they're being charged with child rape and murder. I said, yeah, they need to hang them. You see, that's before I realized I was naive to the system. And most of us are, because we all grew up watching Dragnet and Mayberry RFD and all those shows that show a moral to the story at the end, okay? That's Hollywood. But that has given us blind allegiance to these people that are in the criminal justice system, the judges, officer friendly with the shiny badge that gets up there and takes the oath of office, the prosecutor who says the people, Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, the people. You see, It's this blind allegiance that the criminal justice system makes no mistakes that has affected all the people. They don't want you to think there's any chink in their armor, because we know the banking industry's flawed, we know the medical industry's flawed, our government is corrupt, but they don't want you to think the criminal justice system is. It's that blind allegiance that put 139 men and 1 woman on death row in this country. Now, the 140 of us, we're the very fortunate ones, the lucky ones, the ones that college kids or resources outside the judicial system help expose the truth and free them. How many others weren't as fortunate as me and Nate sitting here? That's because you have a system in place, a life and death system. It's an irreversible punishment. And as Nate so eloquently always says, it's the human factor. Those judges, those prosecutors, these defense lawyers, they're not some god. They are flesh and blood humans who, whether intentionally or just an honest mistake, make mistakes because they're human. And jurors oftentimes convict people just to be safe.
So let me go back, Natasha and Jeannie, I think, also have it. But to get to the point of what are the chances of somebody actually coming out, given life, a guilty person coming out after life without parole?
Let's ask the warden.
Okay, so a person serving life without possibility of parole has no opportunity to be released unless they're able to prove themselves innocent. And that's the only way. And the only way that law could be changed in the state of California is to go back to the voters if the voters wanted to change it. And I think that's virtually impossible. And then you mentioned Charlie Manson, so I do want to tell you about Charlie Manson. Charlie Manson isn't on death row because the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the death penalty. And at that point in time, when they did that, life without possibility of parole was not a punishment available in California. It is now a punishment available in California, and no one gets out who's serving life without possibility of parole unless they prove themselves innocent. And we do have one individual, Obie Anthony, who also works for Death Penalty Focus as a justice advocate, who was serving life without possibility of parole, and he was exonerated. Now, he could have easily have been on death row, but the fact that he was serving life without possibility of parole allowed him the opportunity to prove his innocence, and he did.
And I'm really glad you brought that up and asked that question, because I do think for a lot of people that's the core issue here is everyone wants to have safe families, and how do you guarantee that we're going to have safety in our communities in California? Just yesterday we had an event in Los Angeles with victims and murder victim family members who support the Safe California Act. There are now over 400 murder victim family members who have endorsed the initiative. One of the speakers yesterday is a woman named Rose. Rose was raped when she was 22 years old by a serial killer. The serial killer actually killed 5 women. She is one of 2 women who survived his brutal assault. And as a 22-year-old woman, she knew she had to do everything possible to make sure he never hurt another woman again. And she actually testified against him in 3 trials until he was sentenced to death twice. That's how committed she was to making sure that he would never hurt anyone. That was 28 years ago. He still sits on death row, and the appeals process continues. And Rose now supports the Safe California Act because she has realized that actually the best way to ensure that he never hurts someone else again and that California communities are safe is with life without possibility of parole. She knows that if he is sentenced to life without parole, he will never get out. He will actually be forced to work in prison, which he doesn't now. He will pay into the Victims' Compensation Fund. And it will put an end to the appeals, which have literally tortured her for 28 years. She has seen that, in fact, the death penalty is actually really just helping him because he has lawyers and he has special privileges by being on death row. And what she wants is to forget about him. What she wants is for the money that's being spent on his case to go into things like violence prevention and treatment so that people like him aren't made, aren't created, don't come to be in California anymore. She was just one of the speakers. Another woman who was with us yesterday is Nova Reeves. Her mother was killed by a serial killer in Washington State. She was 16 years old. For over 10 years, she didn't know They didn't know where her mother was. They didn't know. It took 10 years to even solve the crime. And the killer, that serial killer, is serving life without possibility of parole. And she described how that for her was a moment that let her move on with her life. This word of closure, there will never be closure. You cannot close a hole in your heart. She'll never get her mother back. Rose will never get her youth back. But they can be freed from the criminal justice system. And a sentence of life without parole guarantees safety for the community. It means dangerous people will never get out. But it also lets us shift our resources to what we really need to do, which is actually catching more killers and rapists who literally walk free right now. So this initiative is supported by victims who have been through the worst possible experiences, law enforcement who have seen the system firsthand, as well as innocent people who know that we can always make a mistake.
Please, go ahead.
Do you see any positive trends in other states of overturning the death penalty? And why do you think this is I mean, I know states' rights issues, but why isn't it a federal issue as well?
So I'll answer the second one first, and then I'm going to actually ask Randy and Nate to describe their work in other states. So the death penalty is enacted state by state. Each state makes a decision about whether they want to have the death penalty on their books, and as of now, we have 17 states that actually have chosen to use life without parole instead of the death penalty. And it's not a federal issue in the sense that you couldn't pass a federal law that would say to a state, you can't have the death penalty, that the states have the right to determine their own criminal laws. The only way the issue can be addressed on a federal level for the entire country would be through a U.S. Supreme Court decision. As Jeannie mentioned, there was actually a period where the U.S. Supreme Court threw out the death penalty for the entire country, but then they allowed new death penalty laws to come back in 1976 that they thought were going to fix the problems. We know 34 years later that we have all the same problems that we did before. It's clear that the Supreme Court will not get rid of the death penalty across the entire country until enough states on their own have changed their laws. At a certain point, the Supreme Court may say, enough states have done away with the death penalty that the rest of the country has to, but we're not at that point yet. So I know that Randy and Nate have been really active in other states, so maybe you could talk about the importance of what's going on there.
Well, Witness to Innocence has worked in the last 5 states that have abolished the death penalty. And I worked in New Mexico, Connecticut, Illinois, and we've worked in Maryland. We've worked in Wisconsin to keep it from coming back. And I believe that each state is different on their approach to why they should do away with the death penalty. Illinois, for example, was the mistakes that they made. They had to acknowledge it. There was 160 men on death row, and 20 of us were actually innocent. Now, you wouldn't get on an airplane if there was 20 chances in 160 it was going to crash. But yet, the death penalty had crashed years before they put a moratorium in place and years before they abolished it. And I think it's those mistakes and that cost. But each state works on a different approach. And if you can educate the people about the death penalty, the millions of dollars that they will save, like California, for instance, it couldn't be any better example. 28 years of appeals. Now, do you think capital qualified defense lawyers and prosecutors want to see the death penalty abolished? No. You know why? It's a cash cow for them. It's nothing more than a stimulus package that the taxpayers are paying the bill. When you can give somebody life without parole, and this is just my own personal opinion because of being on death row, and then as opposed to life without parole, when you got to deal with 1,000 more violent, more hate, more rage, that there was times, had they rolled that gurney by my cell, I'd have buckled myself on it. Most people have no idea the horrors of maximum security penitentiary life. And to me, being executed would have been early release. It's a miserable existence. And at least when you have life without parole, you don't risk the possibility of executing an innocent person, because you can release an innocent person from prison. You can't release them from the grave, and Nate and I are perfect examples of that.
Good.
I want to say something on the first young lady that spoke about the innocence factor. My position when it comes to the death penalty is primarily the human factor, and that is we all make mistakes. We do it all the time. We can be feeding a baby with the bottle, and we take the nipple and it hits the baby's chin. Mistake. We can make a wrong turn. Mistake. One person can get it wrong. 12 people can get it wrong. 100 people can make an honest mistake. We see it in baseball games. The player slide into the second base. The umpire says, he's out. On further review, he really was safe. That man can come out the dugout and go back to second base. You can't bring a man back from the graveyard. And that's it right there. You don't want that innocence factor there that you know that we're all susceptible to, no matter how much we might want to deny it. It is so true. We make mistakes, and who want to be a mistake? Thank you.
Okay. So one thing I wanted to are you coming up? Go ahead.
So it's clear to me that ballot initiatives in California are very hotly contested, and I'm interested to know a little bit about what you anticipate the opposition is against this bill, how strong it will be, how much funding there is to oppose it. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So the main opposition is the California District Attorneys Association, and they are currently only a little bit active. We haven't seen a lot of activity from the opposition, but that's actually pretty typical for ballot initiatives. The real heat of the campaign will happen in the fall. It's a little bit hard to predict how much money the other side will have. We are facing a big filing deadline of June 30th when all of the political campaigns have to do their disclosures about how much money they have in the bank. So we'll have a little bit more information about that. But honestly, we really won't know until the fall how much money the opposition will have and how much money our campaign will have. I can tell you, kind of just to give you a sense of scale, this is not going to be the biggest spending initiative fight this year in November in California. You know, we're looking at initiatives on the ballot related to taxes and union dues. Those issues, we are expecting each side to spend $40 million or more in those campaigns. You know, our goal for our campaign is much smaller, but we believe that we know from the polling, I can tell you, that the California voters support this initiative. A majority of California voters are on our side. And so we are hopeful that with not as many millions as you'll see in those other fights, that we'll be able to get our message to the key voters in California and really do view this as our moment when we will win this initiative in California.
So I wanted to, go ahead. Come on. My goal is not to ask any questions, you know, so if you guys don't do it, then you know, you're going to be forced with my questions.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I'm wondering if the two gentlemen that were on death row can go into a little bit more detail about what it's like for the experience of being on death row versus life and parole, because I think that financially it makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm wondering what it's actually like if you're accused experientially in prison.
Well, death row is, I mean, when you're somewhere that you know you're not supposed to be for something that you didn't do, you're not comfortable at all. If you're in prison doing a life sentence and you there because you're supposed to be there for something that you did, it's an entirely different mentality. So death row, it creates a stress. It creates tension every single day that can really just cause your mind to just break in half, so to speak. You get news from your daughter that she's hurt or that her birthday is coming up and you can't attend. You get news, like I did, that my mother had died of a heart attack right in the middle of trying to hold my everything together. It's just totally different. And you're there on the yard with a friend who you met while you was on death row, who's scheduled to be executed the next day. It is so different when you're there and you're talking to an individual who tomorrow he's gonna be gone. I feel that's the difference right there, the pressure that comes with the death penalty. Thanks.
And maybe I can ask Jeannie to jump in on this too, since she's the most familiar with California's security systems.
So death row in California is different than death row was in Illinois because they were only allowed out of their cell 1 hour a day. But in California, inmates who are on death row are single-celled. They're either in their cell watching TV or they're out on an exercise yard, which they're allowed to go to 7 days a week for 6 hours a day. In California, they have a legal team for life. So they receive a lot of visits. That legal team tends to take care of them, sends them packages, Christmas presents, make sure they have newspapers. So they really depend on that legal team, and they have visiting. What else did I forget? So I will tell you, as the warden of San Quentin, I met every newly arrived death row inmate in what we call classification. And I met at least 3 inmates who had asked for the death penalty because they understood that death row was an easier way of doing time in California than serving a sentence of life without possibility of parole. Because in this state, when you're serving life without possibility of parole, you're in a maximum security prison, you're double celled, you're expected to work. You're allowed to have visiting only 2 days a week if there's enough room in the visiting room for you to have visitors, because there's a capacity on each of the visiting rooms. And often people will travel to prisons in California and be turned away because the visiting room is full. So you can earn greater privileges if you have life without possibility of parole, but that is the difference. You have to earn those privileges. On death row, those things are given to you in the state of California. That's why it's so much more expensive to be on death row in terms of the housing of death row inmates, because you're isolated from the general population, and either we're bringing the services to you or we're bringing you to the services. So lots of staff involved in all the processes I just described.
So one thing that I think has focused the issue more than any other thing in the last 10 or 15 years is DNA and DNA analysis and the technology that has changed, which offers potentially irrefutable proof of innocence and has cut through some of the layers of bureaucracy. So you want to talk a little bit about the technology changes? Since there's a room, with a lot of technologists involved.
Absolutely. So DNA is probably what's captured people's attention and brought the issue of innocence to the public in a way that few things have. I mean, I'll let Jeannie actually address this because she talks about how much law enforcement has learned from DNA. But what's interesting is these 2 men didn't say the words DNA when they explained to you how they were proven innocent. In fact, their cases didn't involve DNA evidence.
Or any physical evidence at all.
Or any physical evidence. So that's the thing. When there's no physical evidence, it means there's also no physical evidence to prove that you're innocent. So in fact, DNA evidence is available in only about 15% of homicide cases. And in those cases, you can have that tool available to tell you if this is the right person or not. But in fact, the majority of cases, there are no witnesses, there is no DNA, and the kinds of mistakes we heard about continue to happen. So while DNA is an incredible tool that has been very helpful in showing us that we make mistakes, it isn't the silver bullet that's going to make sure that we never make mistakes. But I think Jeannie's perspective is also helpful in this.
Well, what I say about DNA has taught us in law enforcement not to believe everything we think. Through DNA, we found out that eyewitness testimony is wrong more often than it's right. We found out that people falsely confess to crimes. And we found out, which I think we knew all along, we just didn't want to admit we knew it, is that jailhouse snitches lie most of the time. And it's because of DNA that we have the growing number of exonerees in the state of California and around the country, because courts and others are not only questioning those cases where DNA is available, but because of what we've learned from DNA, it's opening the doors to other issues where DNA is not available and people are taking a much more careful look. But DNA is not the answer to this issue. Replacing the death penalty is the answer.
I would like to say that, DNA is fabulous. It's a great safety net, but it's such a small one. When you have other evidence that the prosecutors use, like eyewitness testimony, why is it so hard for people to believe that a jailhouse snitch or a supposed eyewitness to a murder won't get up there on that stand for the prosecution and lie? They do it every day in the courts across this country. Many, many crimes are committed right in the courtroom every day in this country because of prosecutors with their absolute immunity and their qualified immunity clauses that they have. They can suborn perjury, they can fabricate evidence, they can hide evidence, and all of this is what leads to wrongful convictions. You cannot have an irreversible punishment in place when prosecutors have that kind of power and are absolutely immune.
So we only have a few minutes here left. I want to focus on one particular piece of your story, if I can, which is the moment that you found out that you were going to get released, or that, you know, when you got the word that after all these years and all the suffering and all this thing, you know, how did it happen, and what did you feel, and what happened from that moment on till the moment you're reunited from the family? What happened?
Well, it was almost 16 years. As I said, I'd lost every state appeal. When I found out that my federal habeas corpus opinion had come down that morning, but they didn't know the
And
results.
how did you get that news? Who
My
talked?
attorneys called me from out of my cell, and I knew it was either going to be bad news or it was going to be good news. And I sat down in the captain's office, and he handed me the phone. My attorney says, "Randy, are you sitting down?" And I said, "Yes." And she says, "Judge McCuskey had just granted all 17 issues in your federal habeas corpus petition and ordered the state of Illinois to either retry you or release you in 120 days. I'm sitting there, and I said, "Can you repeat that for me, please?" Because that was the first bit of good news that I had had in almost 17 years. But it was shock. It was just as shocking as the moment the jury opened their mouth and convicted me of this crime.
As for me, I was released on bond first. After I got the new trial, the prosecutors told the Illinois Supreme Court that they could not retry me because there is no case. If they upheld my new trial, there's no case. So when I came back for the new trial, I was thinking they was just going to let me go as soon as I went before the judge. But the prosecutor said, we're not bound by what the prosecutor said to the Supreme Court. And they said they was going to retry me. And they set my bond at $1 million. So Governor Ryan, the governor of Illinois at that time, he emptied out death row by giving all the prisoners on death row a pardon. When he done that, one of my best friends, Aaron Patterson, came home. He was completely exonerated. He got his state compensation pay, and he put up $100,000 and came and bonded me out. We had made a pact while we was on death row that whichever one of us get out first would reach back and get the other. When the guards came to my cell and told me, pack up, you're going home, I really thought he was joking, but I started packing up, but I don't know why I was thinking he was joking. But it was real. I packed my things up, and I went to downstairs, and they processed me out. And when I got to the last gate, I had a folder with me. And I told the guard, what next? He said, just walk out that door. I said, just walk out? He said, yeah. And so I walked out the door, and as I was walking, I smelled something that I hadn't smelled. And when I looked up, it was a tree. It was a tree high in the air over my head. And I almost fell right on my face right then on the ground. I had to catch my balance. I thought about what made me do that, and it was the fact that I hadn't been under a tree in 18 years. And it threw me off. But then I walked on out, and all my family, the press, it was beautiful.
Oh, great. So I can't imagine a better way to end today than that story. I want to thank everyone for being here. I think it's really been I feel like the education that we get from hearing the stories of people that are inside the system and understand it is just so different than we sometimes see, you know, in the media and on the television and other things. And I just want to thank you very much for bringing your stories, you know, to Google and to, you know, the people that will watch the video, because I think it's a very important issue, and I think your perspectives are incredibly important to get the word out on changes that we as citizens of California can potentially make. And I think the other thing that's important is that California is kind of a bell ringer for the rest of the world and for the United States in general, that if California goes, if California changes its law, if we go with life without parole, there's a very good chance that the rest of the nation will follow us. And I think the stakes are very high, and I appreciate the time that each of you have spent with this issue, and Natasha for leading this effort, and I wish you the very best of luck. So thank you, everybody.